Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no bed. I was brought up and told to have no bed. I was brought up and told to have no bed.
Welcome to the Full Circle Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, David Roberts, along with the OG Dr. Neil Holmes. Today, we have a special guest that's going to talk about a serious topic, something that I think our general public needs to know more about. We have Mr. Thomas Assefa. He's an American, but he's an Ethiopian living in America, and we're going to talk a little bit about the what's going on in Ethiopia right now, and how the U.S. government is sort of involved in benefiting from what's going on. So, Thomas, just for the uninitiated, give us a brief overview of what exactly is going on in Ethiopia right now.
Sure. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
No problem.
So the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, was the dominant political party in the coalition that ruled Ethiopia for 27 years, from 1991 to 2008. And then in 2018. And then after a popular uprising and mass protests, the TPLF was ousted from power, and a reformist faction within the ruling coalition emerged with a new prime minister, Abiy Ahmed, and a new leadership established a new government. And so between 2018 and November 2020, the TPLF was becoming more and more marginal inside the broader politics of Ethiopia. And so basically, after resisting the reform efforts of the new government, waged pretty much a violent coup d'etat by attacking the northern military base in the northern region of Ethiopia, again, trying to come back into power.
Okay. Now, something I heard about when I did my research was forced famine. What is that about? As I understand, they're not allowing trucks of food to go into certain areas, and they're forcing people to starve, basically.
So there's a lot of misconceptions about this war. So I think it may be helpful for me to give you a sort of a brief overview of sort of what happened there. Okay. So in November 2021, just this past November, the United Nations and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission released a joint report after investigating violations of international human rights in northern Ethiopia between November 3rd of 2020 and June 28th of 2021. And so, although the investigation concludes that atrocities were committed by both sides, so by both the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and the Ethiopian government, the investigation concluded that there's no evidence of genocide that took place in Tigray. And then the other piece of the allegation is what you're alluding to. There's no evidence of food being used as a weapon of war. And in fact, the report found evidence that ethnic cleansing by the TPLF had been carried out in Amhara, in a place called Maikadra, where over 1,600 people were massacred because of their Amhara ethnicity. And so, last June, the Ethiopian government announced a unilateral ceasefire in order to allow for humanitarian corridors to take place, right? So that, important aid could go into the Tigray region. But the TPLF declared that as a sick joke. And in fact, in order to pursue its aim of taking back power again forcefully, decided to invade neighboring regions, Amhara and the Afar regions. And so that completely prevented any kind of humanitarian aid going into the Tigray region. And, you know, we have two UN officials, two UN whistleblowers who systematically documented how the TPLF has been working with some rogue UN officials at the top to sort of help redirect aid, humanitarian aid, going into Tigray. You know, so for example, there's over 1,000 missing trucks that went from mainland Ethiopia into Tigray, carrying much needed humanitarian assistance that the TPLF redirected to one, to provide aid or to use the food to feed its combatants, but also to transport its combatants into further regions of Ethiopia on its way to the capital city to again capture power. And so that's the narrative. So we hear in the Western media that the Ethiopian government is blockading Tigray region, but it's the opposite that's happening.
Now, one of the it appears that one of the issues is the question of what's going to be the nature of the government. Is it going to be a more centralized government, or is it going to be a federal government where power would be concentrated in the regions? Could you talk a little bit about that, and also how the nature of ethnicity inside of Ethiopia and how that might impact on that question of federalism versus centralism?
You know, it might be helpful to just step back a little bit and go into a little bit of history in terms of for your audience to understand this whole notion of ethnic federalist politics, if I may do so. So the TPLF back in the 80s and 90s fought alongside the Eritrean People's Liberation Front against Ethiopia's oppressive military junta at the time, the Derg. And through the creation of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, established a new constitution in Ethiopia in 1991 that sort of carved up Ethiopia along ethnic lines, right? And so you have the Amhara regional state, the Tigrayan regional state, the Oromia regional state. Basically, you know, for your audience to understand, it would be something analogous to, for instance, in the United States, having a Black particular region, a white region, an Asian region, and a Latino region. And the way the Constitution is written is, you know, on paper, it says that these different ethnic regions have self-determination, can have the power to self-govern. But eventually what actually happened is the TPLF-led coalition as the sort of dominant force within that coalition used this constitution as a way to divide and conquer different regions of Ethiopia. So they're the ones who would administer or who would nominate the presidents or the regional head of each ethnic region. And, you know, like dictated a lot of the socio-economic and political factors in those regions. And so, you know, there's this sort of contestation between, Neil, to your question, what's going to happen sort of in this next transition phase? Is this ethnic federalism going to continue? Or, you know, do we have sort of a different system? And so it's actually at one of the root structural problems and conditions that has, you know, that goes back to the movement of the 1960s of the student movement at the time, resisting the imperial regime of Haile Selassie. And what's going to happen now is there's a major nationwide dialogue between all of these different opposition parties, between all of these different entities, those who share this sort of commitment to ethnic federalist politics, and then those who have sort of, you know, I don't necessarily like to put them in that camp, but sort of this Unitarian, Ethiopianist, an orientation that sort of has a narrative around Ethiopia, 3,000 years history, a non-colonized entity, at least not colonized by any European power. And so this is where it's going to be a critical phase, right? Where to have a dialogue, a nationwide dialogue that we've never had before on this particular question. Do we continue to have ethnic federalism? What's the role of the various different regions in relationship to central authority? Do we have something else? Do we change the constitution? And so this is an opportunity for the first time, at least in my lifetime, where the Ethiopian people have an opportunity to sort of map that out for the next period.
Now you mentioned some of the larger groups, the Oromo, the Amhara, the Tigray, and so forth. What about the smaller groups, the smaller ethnic groups that, what role will they have to make sure that their interests are also, their voices are heard? Do they have any collective voice in this process?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Under this new reformist government, this government that emerged out of the previous coalition, although the TPLF-led government had a constitution on paper that says any ethnic group or any entity that wants to form its own administrative region has the self-determination to do so, the TPLF-led government never allowed that. But last year, I believe it was last year, there's a new region within the southern nations and nationalities, one whole grouping of multiple ethnicities that was under a specific region, the Sidama region, that petitioned the federal government to have its own autonomous region. They petitioned, the House of Representatives approved it. This is under the new government. And they had their referendum last year. And now we have another new region, right? We haven't seen this in 30 years. And so, it all depends where we go next. But this commitment to a multi sort of national ethnic federalism still stands right now as it is based on this constitution. Now, what comes next? We don't know. But so all that to say, at least through this reformed government, there is the potential to have smaller ethnic groupings to form their own autonomous self-governed regions.
Now, Thomas, I have kind of like a two-part question, and let me give you some background. I'm a school counselor, and so this year I have two seniors that are Ethiopian and still have family in Ethiopia. So both of them, their parents asked me to write a letter and address it to, I guess it's the American embassy over in Ethiopia. Maybe it's the Ethiopian embassy. I could be wrong on that. But I had to write these letters and state that, yes, this student is in good standing, and as long as they do this, this, and this, they'll be graduating in June, so on and so forth. And so I sent that to the parents, and I guess they have to send that over to the embassy so that their family over there are free to travel here in June to see their relative graduate high school. Now, as far as is the American government, and you may not know, but is the American government driving that, or is it the current Ethiopian government that's driving that kind of thing, that kind of restriction, I guess I would call it?
Well, I mean, that kind of restriction actually to come here is under the jurisdiction of the United States government, right? Like allowing somebody's family member to travel here, whether they have a visa or not. The Ethiopian government, to my knowledge, won't or does not prevent anybody from leaving the country to go to the US or elsewhere.
And because this is the first time I've ever had to do that, and it was twice in like a couple of weeks, back to back.
My understanding is, I think the way I understood it is parents asking, you as an American who knows these students, to write a letter to the U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia so that the U.S. Embassy can approve their visa to come here, is how I understand.
Right, that's how I understood. You know, I just said, hey, it's for my kids, you know, take care of it. And that leads me to my second question, because you and I had a conversation prior to this. How is the U.S. government involved in this? Are they driving any of this, and how do they benefit, if at all?
Yeah, it's a good
That's
question.
A loaded question.
It's the biggest question. Yeah. So, you know, just for some context, once the new prime minister took power, the new government came into being, there were a number of reforms that have been initiated over the past 3 years. And, you know, one of which, when thinking about sort of the geopolitical factors in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia established a joint declaration on comprehensive cooperation between Somalia. So this cooperation between Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, right? And so the U.S. sees this as a threat to its hegemony in the region. And so central to the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia is the competition for social, political, and economic control of both Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa region. Over the past 27 years, during the TPLF-led government, that particular government has been doing the bidding of the United States, particularly as acting as the US's proxy actor on the so-called war on terror in Somalia, or in that Horn of Africa region. The TPLF eventually also led an expansionist war with Eritrea in 1998. And, you know, Eritrea has been sort of, from the perspective of the United States, one of the rogue nations in the Horn of Africa region, because the Eritreans have been pretty assertive in their sovereignty, right, and in their self-determination, and telling the U.S. to not meddle in their internal affairs. And so, you know, Abiy, Prime Minister Abiy, was seen as this sort of new reformer from the United States perspective, from the Western world, but he quickly fell from grace. And there's a number of issues I think that's important to sort of talk about why that happens, and has implications for the role that the United States is playing in the Horn of Africa, and particularly in this conflict in Ethiopia. And so, one, you know, the TPLF is no longer a dominant force, and the Democratic Party faction of the United States, of the ruling class of the United States, has had very deep ties with the TPLF in realizing its self-interest in the Horn of Africa region. Now that entity is sidelined from Ethiopian politics, and therefore from the Horn of Africa politics. Susan Rice, who is in the Biden administration, has been working with the TPLF-led government for the past 15, 20 years to move forward US-based interests in that region. You know, the other critical thing to note is that Ethiopia is becoming a destination for international mining investors, right? And developers. It's got untapped, diverse, and vast mineral resources. We are witnessing a new industrial revolution in this age of high tech and all things internet. And so Africa right now has, you know, massive amounts of precious metals that are abundant all over the continent. That's going to be very integral for this industrial revolution. And then the other reason is that Ethiopia has, you know, like Ethiopia also, just like any other nation, cares about its own self-interests, right, for its own people. Mm-hmm. And so they have relationships with countries like China, right? And so right now we're in the context of a new Cold War between the United States and China. And China has committed to not be involved in internal domestic affairs. And Ethiopia sees this as a positive thing, right? And so this can be a threat to the United States because ultimately, United States wants to be the only entity to establish its hegemony in that region. And then finally, I'll say Egypt is another critical player here. Egypt is a very close ally of the United States vis-a-vis the Middle East and brokering peace in so-called peace within the Middle East region and the role it plays in sort of putting other Arab states in check in relationship to Israel. And the Egyptians are very upset and see this. There's a huge dam that Ethiopia is building, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Nile River on the Ethiopian side of the border. And the Egyptians see this as a security threat. They don't want to see this dam being built. This is a dam that will be the largest hydroelectric power generator on the continent, and the 7th largest in the world. And so the United States has to side with the Egyptians on this. You know, Egypt is a recipient of $1.3 billion in military aid from the United States without any kind of human rights conditions or any other conditions attached. And so all of these factors play into the role that the United States is playing right now, and so because Abiy has asserted himself and Ethiopia as a sovereign nation, is willing to work with entities like China and Russia, which I haven't talked about, is willing to also sort of create regional unity among countries that the United States sees as adversarial, meaning Somalia and Eritrea. All of these have, and of course, you know, there's the deep ties between the Democratic Party establishment and the previous government. All of this adds up, and hence why we see the Biden administration not only putting its thumb on the scale in favor of the TPLF in this conflict, but outright supporting the TPLF. You know, like Ethiopia has for the first time in 30 years, a democratically elected government. But the United States is finding it very hard to acknowledge that the current new government is the Ethiopian government. I mean, now they're forced to do so, of course, given the shift in the balance of power. And so, you know, a lot of us are upset with how the United States has been inserting itself in this conflict against an entity that was pushed out by the people of Ethiopia, and now that's waging a violent coup d'état to overthrow the elected government.
Let me ask you a kind of a triple question. I don't know, but and I want to start with, you know, back in the just before World War II broke out, the Italians invaded Ethiopia, and there was a response in the Black community in this country, a huge response. You had rallies, about 100,000 people in New York and, you know, places like that. You had fights breaking out between Blacks and Italians in New York and Philadelphia and those sorts of places on the East Coast. And there had always been this kind of fascination with Ethiopia. You know, you had these biblical verses that said, you know, princess shall come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia she'll stretch forth her hands unto God, and all of that. And then, you know, when you talk about a Cold War between U.S. and China today, the old Cold War between U.S. and the Soviet Union, you had a guy by the name of Kwame Nkrumah who attempted to say that the way forward for Africa was for Africa to unite itself so that it itself could become a world power and would not just be caught in this kind of cross fire. But it had to, at the same time, locate itself someplace ideologically in the world. Now, in Ethiopia, here's my questions. One, what's the nature of economic development in Ethiopia right now? Two, what role would Ethiopia play in the development of a unified Africa, which could withstand, any kind of outside influence, which itself could become a major power in the world? I'm talking about unified Africa. And three, the third part of that, in addition to China and the U.S. as these big players, you also have some other players that appear to be hovering about: the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Turkey, etc. What role are they going to play? What role are they going to play? And you use this term, lastly, you use this term Horn of Africa. What is the Horn of Africa, and why is it significant to Africa itself and to the rest of the world?
All right, I hope I capture everything there. So with your first question around the kind of economic development or system that we have in Ethiopia, I will say during the TPLF-led government, the model of economic development oriented around a state-based capitalist orientation, right? And so the TPLF-led government, working with state-owned corporations and other organizations, by establishing sort of 5 to 10 year development, economic development goals, sort of had a monopoly on the the economy of Ethiopia, right? However, though, they would provide concessions to invite foreign direct investment, so by leasing agricultural land to Saudi Arabia, or corporations for agricultural commercial entities from India, etc., and which has its own negative consequences, right? And the land grabbing, displacing people, and so on and so forth. And in fact, we know of the Ogaden massacre that took place in the early 2000s, when the people, the pastoralists in that region, were pushed out. And so since the new government has taken power, there's been a sort of an orientation towards a neoliberal orientation, right? Like privatizing certain sectors of the economy that had been previously nationalized. And I think this is what was one of the first sort of things that the Western world, particularly the United States, saw in this new government as an opportunity to, there's a new neoliberal prime minister, we could work together. But, of course, everything else has shifted. And so we're still, it's yet to be seen, right? Like this government has been working to put out fires that the TPLF has been igniting all over the country. And so it hasn't had a chance to really focus on the economic development. In fact, we're in a huge economic crisis right now because of this conflict, the war, and everything associated with it. Now, in terms of Pan-Africanism and, going back to the history, Ethiopia has always been an inspiration for Black people in the diaspora, as a country, as one of the only countries in Africa has never been colonized by a European power, right? And so, there are even stories about people in Harlem signing up to volunteer and go fight the Italian fascists in the 1930s, right? Although the U.S. government didn't allow that. I'm not sure if you've been following, as this conflict was raging, and as we, get a very sort of crystal clear assessment of how the United States and even the European Union is asserting itself in this conflict and meddling in the internal affairs, there's been a very large social movement that's been ignited, starting in the diaspora, and now that's sort of moving into the African continent. It originally started as an online campaign under the hashtag No More, right? No more imperialism, no more neocolonial intervention in Africa. And that has, in line with supporting the Ethiopian government in asserting its sovereignty against neocolonial imperialist intervention. And this has been an inspiration for not only those of us here engaging in that fight, but also for other African countries in Africa, particularly movements in Africa. And so, Pan-Africanism has had its moments and failures, but I think what's been galvanized around this campaign, around this movement now, the No More movement, there is a recognition that imperial forces from the West are doing a lot of damage to the continent of Africa. And so this has been very inspiring to watch. The promises have yet to bear fruit. And so, this is too soon to say, we're in a Pan-Africanist moment where, we're moving towards some form of unity of all African states. I mean, it's yet to be seen. But the role that Ethiopia has been playing in resisting U.S. intervention right now is unprecedented for many African countries in the region, and so the Horn of Africa and the significance of the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa includes a number of countries: Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Kenya. And a whole host of others in eastern part of Africa. And this is right on the Red Sea Peninsula, right? And this is a particularly important artery in the global capitalist commercial, that's where the whole commerce. If you all remember last year, there was a huge cruise ship that got a huge ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, and that really disrupted global commerce and had reverberations across the globe economically. And so it's a very significant region. And countries like the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, see this as a vital region to establish some form of economic influence and even military influence in that region. And this region is also, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of like the kind of resources and minerals that are available to sort of move forward this next industrial revolution. These other countries, including China and Russia, see that there's a huge possibility for a market and for selling their goods and services in Africa. And so at the end of the day, it's all about, gaining that kind of dominance and or influence. I hope I answered your questions, Neil.
Yeah, I think you did. One last piece though, we have, you talk about Susan Rice, but you also have Samantha Power there, and Samantha Power was in many ways the architect of the toppling of Gaddafi in Libya, with this thing called humanitarian intervention. And so we also see in that region the war on terror. You look at Somalia, you look at Djibouti being a big army base in many ways. So then the Sudan right next door. How does all that play in terms of what's at stake here?
Specifically, like in terms of what's happening in the Sudan?
No, in terms of, Ethiopia, in terms of relating to all of that, because you have that, when when Biden said we're ending this 20-year war in Afghanistan, then the next day we saw troops, special forces going to the Congo, and we see kind of like a shifting of emphasis. I mean, already you have AFRICOM forces in just about every country in Africa. And we had a mobilization, the largest mobilization in the history of this region, in Virginia, I'm talking about in terms of National Guard. You had a mobilization of National Guard, who will be eventually sent to the Horn. So what, there's this other piece that's also playing out in the region, and how does Ethiopia, or how do these other powers, how does the U.S. in particular see this happening? And just to pick up one thing, one of the things that came out of the Trump administration was they said they're going to begin to pivot from this war on terror to this war to preparing for war against China and Russia. And we see that also, these things occur across political parties. And so we begin to see more of an emphasis on looking at China and Russia. So how does this larger world war, or this larger international military process play out in terms of Ethiopia and its impact on the people of Ethiopia as they attempt to come to some kind of maybe peaceful resolution to their issue?
Well, as you know, China has been playing a major role in Africa, particularly through its Belt and Road Initiative, right? To establish this sort of mass system for really, China is becoming the dominant superpower. I mean, we just have to acknowledge that, one of the dominant superpowers here, right? And so there's a contestation between the United States and China. And as China emerges as a contending global superpower economically, it's played a huge role on the African continent without meddling in internal affairs, right? So by way of infrastructure, by way of providing critical economic development aid to a lot of African countries, and its gateway has been through the Horn of Africa. Given the role that the Horn of Africa plays in sort of this whole Belt and Road initiative. And so, over the past 27 years, Ethiopia has been the client state for the United States for the United States to assert its geopolitical interest in that region. But now the TPLF is no longer the dominant force, right? This is through the TPLF-led government. Mm-hmm. And so that essentially means that Ethiopia, the United States needs to look for a different anchor state in that region to help continue establishing its hegemony, especially as China becomes dominant in that region. And so, as this conflict started, it thought that it can support the TPLF to come back into power. I mean, it's not really overtly, but covertly, right? That failed. Somalia has a new president that's doing a really good job over there in terms of creating some form of national unity and stabilizing Somalia. Somalia has had its rough challenges and internal conflict for decades. Eritrea is another country in the Horn that has asserted itself and has resisted any kind of U.S. intervention for the past 30 years. And so there's no potential ally for the United States in that region. They try to work with the Sudanese government, but Sudan is experiencing its own internal contradictions, right? They're, as you all know, the people of Sudan ousted the military dictatorship under Bashir, and then there was this sort of alliance between the military and the civil council that represented the people of Sudan, and now the military has undertaken a coup d'état, and so like there's massive unrest, and so the U.S. cannot rely on the Sudan to do its bidding. And so from the vantage point of the United States is really losing influence in the Horn of Africa right now. And, I think, I'm not sure if there are different factions within the U.S. foreign policy industrial complex that are not working hand in hand, because it's very confusing in terms of what's happening. But what we're seeing from our, the implications of that is that people are dying, right? They are aiding this sort of rebel group to come back into power because they have a deeper relationship with that particular entity and not the new government. And it's going to have to be sooner or later that they'll have to realize that they have to work with the Ethiopian government if they want to continue to have some form of influence in that region. Otherwise, China is going to assert itself. Last week, the Chinese announced the appointment of a special envoy for the Horn of Africa region. And I think this has the Biden administration alarmed. And so now, the first time the Biden administration had a direct conversation with the new Prime Minister of Ethiopia since the Biden administration, came into the presidency, just happened yesterday, the day before yesterday, right? This is unheard of. And so now they're beginning to realize that, we can't let the Horn of Africa slip through our fingers. And so, this could be an opportunity. And, Ethiopia's role is not to sort of side with one entity or another. We have Ethiopia has a multi-aligned orientation. We'll be willing to work with any country, any entity that serves the interests of Ethiopia.
Now, actually, and it's interesting that because that leads to my last question, because I like to always end with sort of a call to action. You mentioned the diaspora a couple of times, and as someone with a Pan-African perspective, I've struggled with this for years, trying to convince just people I know to view themselves as part of the African diaspora, as opposed to just a Black American, and you're separate from this person from Ethiopia or Jamaica, so on and so forth. So I guess my question to you would be, what can Africans in America do to support a peaceful resolution to what's going on in Ethiopia? Just like, I guess it was 30 years ago, Africans in America thought there were certain things we had to do to support the fall of apartheid in South Africa. So like, what can we do now to support a peaceful resolution to what's going on in Ethiopia that would benefit the vast majority of the Ethiopian people?
Just going back to what we were talking about earlier, historically, there are deep ties between the African-American community and, Ethiopia, right? Ethiopia has played a significant role in the imagination of Black folk in the U.S., right? As a country that's never been colonized, as a country that inspired others to fight for their independence on the continent. And so rooted in that historical context, I think I'm going to focus on the African American community specifically, is a critical player within the Democratic Party, right? And Ethiopians in the diaspora have also, those of us that are Ethiopian Americans, find ourselves aligned, or most Ethiopians find themselves aligned in this two-party system that we have, aligned with the Democratic Party versus the Republicans, right? But given what the Biden administration has been pursuing in anti-Ethiopia foreign policy this past year, there's been an exodus of Ethiopian Americans, particularly in the elections in Virginia last year, away from the Democratic Party, and for the first time in their lives, for most of them, voting Republican. We also know from the African American community, the Democratic Party takes Black folk for granted, I mean, I'll be honest, right? And Black folk are a critical player in the Democratic Party coalition, but the party never, effectively delivers for Black folk. Black folk have to fight here, and so I think what African Americans in the U.S. can do is to pressure the Biden administration and other, representatives in their various regions, in their various states, their congressional delegation, to do the right thing when it comes to the Horn of Africa, right? Like a Black nation in the Horn of Africa is asserting its sovereignty, is asserting its right to self-determination. And here you have a global superpower, the United States, trying to dictate the terms of the destiny of that country, this country that's been around for thousands of years, way before even the United States. And so engaging your congressional representatives, reaching out to your senators, and really getting them to stop the punitive actions that the Biden administration is taking. There's a number of sanctions that the Biden administration and other critical Democrats in the foreign relations committees in both the Senate and House are undertaking. That's going to, like the sanctions don't help because ultimately they hurt poor, vulnerable, working class people in Ethiopia, as we see in other countries where sanctions have been pushed by the United States. So that's what I would urge the African American community here to do, is to pressure their representatives to stop the Biden administration from taking a punitive action, and recognize that our relationship between the United States and Ethiopia goes back a long time, particularly between the people. When I think about Black folk and Ethiopians back in Ethiopia.
Hey, well, Thomas, I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience have learned a lot in just our short time. And I'm glad you gave us some specifics on what we could do. Finally, is there one organization, and if you don't know their website offhand, that's fine. I can look it up and put it in the reference section when we post this. But is there one organization in particular that the African American community should reach out to in order to get more information? Excuse me.
Right now, so there's a united front of organizations. The one organization that comes to mind is a relatively new organization out, and I wouldn't say it's a very sort of leftist kind of orientation, but is working to continue ensuring that there's a positive relationship between the U.S. and in Ethiopia, and that's the American Ethiopian Public Affairs Committee. I would also urge folks to look up the Answer Coalition, which has been working with us in the diaspora in ensuring that the U.S. doesn't intervene militarily in Ethiopia. And then, like the Breakthrough News, although it's not an organization, it's a media entity, has been doing pretty good work in covering Ethiopia in such a way that the mainstream media has not.
Okay. Well, again, thanks for all the information. Thanks for the resources. And we'll have to have you on again another time as a follow-up as this develops.
Thank you so much. Thanks for reaching out. I appreciate this.
No problem. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no